Hi everyone, thank you all very much for coming out tonight to a special sneak preview of A River Changes Course, winner of the World Cinema Grand Jury Prize for documentary at the 2013 Sundance Film Festival. This evening is a collaboration between the School of Cinematic Arts, the USC Levin Institute for Humanities and Ethics as part of their Cinema of Substance series, the USC Office of Religious Life, and Migrant Films. We're very lucky to have the director of the film here, Kalyanee Mam, sorry, I forgot to cut that wrong, and Dean Varun Soni, from the Dean of Religious Life here at the University of Southern California, who will moderate the Q&A to follow.
Okay, great. My name is Varun Soni. I'm the Dean of Religious Life here at the University of Southern California, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to welcome you all to our very special screening of A River Changes Course. I just want to thank Alex Ago and Lynn Boyd-Judson from Outside the Box Office and Cinema with Substance, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. So let's just hear it for our sponsors. You know, I'm really excited. We've done a number of films here in the past, but I'm especially excited to introduce you to this filmmaker for this film, because I've known her for the last 12 years. Kalyanee Mam and I, we went to law school together at UCLA, but please don't hold that against us. We were kind of like the black sheep. We were the only ones who didn't have corporate law aspirations, and it's been a real joy to see how her career has unfolded since then. Kalyanee, the story for Kalyanee is a very personal story. She was born in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge regime. She has some harrowing stories about her family's trying to escape. I think they tried to escape 12 times before they finally made it to the Thai-Cambodian border. Stories of going through jungles with landmines. And they finally were able to immigrate to the United States in 1981. And since then, so much of her work and her life has been sort of informed by her life story. As an undergraduate at Yale, Kalyanee was very involved with the Cambodian Genocide Project, where she worked to create programs and opportunities and initiatives to spread awareness about the genocide in Cambodia. And as a law student, she spent a lot of time doing human rights law. She worked in Iraq, in Mozambique, in China, with a number of different organizations and agencies really focusing on advocating for refugees and other folks in terms of human rights interventions. When she graduated from law school, she went into sort of photography and filmmaking. Her first film is Between Earth and Sky, which follows the lives and struggles of 3 young Iraqi refugees living in Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. She was also the cinematographer for the Oscar-winning documentary Inside Job, which focused on the global financial crisis of 2008. And this film, A River Changes Course, won the World Cinema Grand Jury Prize for documentary film at the 2013 Sundance Film Festival, as well as the Golden State Award for Best Feature Documentary at the San Francisco International Film Festival. She's been touring not just the country, but the world, and we'll talk to her about that during the Q&A, including taking the film to Cambodia to show it. The way we'll run it is I'm going to introduce her now to introduce the film. Then we'll do a moderated conversation afterwards and a Q&A with all of you. So please stick around for that. All that being said, please join me in giving a warm Trojan welcome to Kalyanee Mam.
Thank you, Varun. I'd like to thank the USC School of Cinematic Arts and Alex Ago. See, I messed up your name too now. But everyone here, the sponsors and everyone who took the time and the opportunity to come here and view this film. But before I even get into that, I just want to say, Astro, this is the first time I ever saw your film, and it's really beautiful, and it really touches on the themes of this film, which is about hope, and actually the film is about 3 families, and one of the families are Jam, and if you're not aware, Jam Muslims there are about 200,000 Cham Muslim people living in Cambodia today, and they're an ethnic minority that many people are not aware of. They have a very distinct culture and religion, and they're facing many challenges that you'll see, in the film. But thank you for sharing that with us, and it's a really beautiful film. But this story is about hope, and I hope that you will see that hope reflected in the film. But the film is about three families struggling against the challenges of development and globalization and trying to maintain their traditional way of life, as the modern world closes in around them. But, hopefully at the end of the film that you'll see that there is, maybe there is some hope, to the film and to the struggles that the people are going through. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A afterwards, especially with Varun. I think we're going to have a very interesting and lively conversation, maybe a conversation that you'll not often hear. But hopefully the conversation will be very much inspired by the film. And hope you enjoy the film, and we'll speak afterwards. Thank you.
This is my first time seeing this film, and I was really moved by it. And especially the way that you told two stories. You told this bigger story about globalization in Cambodia, sort of the dark side of that, through this intimate story about families. And I'm wondering how you approach these stories, and where did you find these stories? Is this something you set out to do? Did you find them as you met families or in the editing room? How did it all come together?
Thanks, Varun. First of all, I'm just so happy, to be able to share this film with all of you. It's been an incredible journey, from 2008 when we first met Sidi, in the floating village in his home, and him telling us his story about his life and what he was struggling with, and the challenges of fishing, on the lake, and the dwindling fish population in his village. And since I met him, I knew that I wanted to tell his story and the story of other Cambodian people, in Cambodia who are struggling through the same things, like Sasamorn, in the jungles in the forest, and Kyo, in the countryside, and forced to leave her village, to find work in the garment factories. And I wanted to tell the story of that life and their struggles, but in my mind, I also wanted to tell that bigger story, of the struggles of many people, especially indigenous and marginalized people, all over the world. We've been screening this film, all over the world in different countries like South Korea and Colombia and, in Eastern Europe and, everywhere, and of course in Cambodia as well. And the reception has been really remarkable. People have been really touched by the film and touched by the stories and touched by the families. But many people have felt that they are seeing the stories of their lives, unfolding on screen. And, as we touch on this further, I'd like us to talk about that more, how their lives are connected to your lives. But first, speaking of connection, we were wondering if, Jennifer's going to go around passing a clipboard, and if you'd like to stay connected with us, please sign up, and we'll inform you of future screenings of a River Changes course and keep you informed about what is happening in Cambodia, because a lot is happening, and I'd like to talk about that more tonight. I went, to Cambodia to document the elections, the 5th national elections in Cambodia, and there have been an increasing number of protests in the last few days against the election results, and so we'll talk about that more soon. But first, to answer Varun's question, the stories, the families. I met Sidi in 2008, but first I've been traveling to Cambodia for years, since 1998, during the summer of my junior year of college, to write for a senior thesis project on crimes committed against women. That's another paper. On the endurance of the Cambodian family under the Khmer Rouge regime. And when I went to Cambodia in 1998, I saw Cambodia that no longer exists today. I went there, and my first experience, back to my homeland after being gone for 17 years, flying over the countryside. I was on the plane on my way down, touching down into the tarmac of the airport, and I saw from above, I saw the rice fields, and the palm trees, And I mean, it was just rice fields and palm trees at that time. It was a completely different place, and my heart was thumping, my stomach was, grumbling, and butterflies were in my stomach, and I couldn't believe, that I was coming back to my homeland. But what I saw was just such a beautiful place, and that summer I just completely fell in love with my country. I traveled all over the country and interviewed families, and I even traveled to Ratanak, where South Samoan and her family are from. And when I went to that area, it was completely covered with forests in 1998. We had to fly, to get there because we couldn't get there any other way. The roads were too rough or didn't really exist at all. Today, in 2013, almost all that forest is gone. Completely destroyed. There are only rubber plantations there now. Cassava plantations, like the one that City is working in. And sugar plantations. And the timber that's cut down, they're not even used inside the country. They're not even being manufactured in the country. They're being shipped abroad to be manufactured abroad. And then the furniture made out of that wood is being shipped back to Cambodia. The sugar that's being processed in Cambodia is being shipped to Europe. The cassava that the plantation where Sadi works on, that cassava is not even the kind of cassava that you can eat. It's the kind of cassava that is made into ethanol, and the processing doesn't even occur in Cambodia. It occurs in China. So none of these families are benefiting from the output or the benefits of globalization and development. Back to what I was saying, I'm sorry. So that's, 1998 was the first time I saw Cambodia, the first time I went back to my homeland. But when I went back to Cambodia in 2008, and I had been traveling back and forth, I could see the difference. But in 2008, I saw a difference that I couldn't even imagine before. The country, like I said, completely changed overnight. And Phnom Penh itself, really changed. There were big buildings that were, erected that were not there before. And I mean, I'm not saying the development is bad, but I'm just wondering about that process of development, if it takes into account people's lives, if it takes into account, the consequences, the environmental consequences. And in the case of Cambodia, that's not being taken into account. And what I wanted to do at that time was to document it, before it was too late. I'm sure all of you, if some of you may be familiar about Cambodia, but if you are familiar, have any familiarity with Cambodia, you're probably familiar with the Khmer Rouge regime. You're familiar with the genocide that occurred in Cambodia, where nearly 2 million people were killed. But you're not familiar with the genocide, I would say, the atrocity, I would say, that is happening in Cambodia today, where thousands of families are being thrown off their land and stripped of their livelihood, stripped of their access to forests, access to their farmland, access to their spirits. For South Samoan and her family, the forest is where the spirits live. It's where the protector of the land live. Once that forest is destroyed, the spirit is gone. The spirit disappears. There's no one to protect her and her family. There's nothing to protect us. And in a way that's really symbolic, once we destroy nature, once we destroy our spirit, once we destroy the source of life, the water, the land, each other, we have nothing. And these are the challenges that, Sadi and South Samoan and Kyo and their families are faced with right now. they're faced with that challenge of trying to preserve, what is beautiful in all of us, which is the natural world around us. At least this is what I think, and the families and the friends and the relationships and the connection and the culture and the tradition and the way of life that makes life, so beautiful. Without those things, we don't have that. And what I wanted to say in the introduction was, I hope, when you were watching this film, that you saw something in the film reflected in you too. That, maybe watching the families, joking with one another, playing with one another, and even the father trying to wake up his little daughter, to fish, and the love and care that they have for one another. Maybe that, reminds you of your home and your family, or maybe it even reminds you of what you've lost because of everything that is happening in the world right now, because of how hard you have to work every day, to feed your family. I think that life in the United States is as much a struggle as it is in Cambodia, as it is in Colombia, as it is in South America, as it is in Egypt or Syria or Jordan or, everywhere in the world. I think it's a struggle. We're all trying to make ends meet. At least I am. I don't know about your situation, but I am trying to make ends meet myself as a filmmaker. The price of healthcare has risen exponentially. The price of education is out of control. I'm still paying off my law school loans at this moment, and I have no idea when I'm going to pay that off. And our wages have not gone up. It's all relative. Kyo, her wages was $61 when I, first met her. It's supposedly gone up to $80, although they haven't really seen the benefit of that. And they can't survive on $80 a month. And neither can we, or the teachers that teach our children in the United States, survive on $40,000 a year, or $50,000, or whatever that may be. Some even $25,000 a year. So I feel that, what is happening in Cambodia is not just in Cambodia. We don't have to look very far to understand and to feel and to know that the impact of globalization is very close to home.
I think extraordinary creative decisions in this film that work really well. And one of them I found was your decision not to use a voiceover and really let the story unfold. It's a very quiet, almost meditative, contemplative journey that we take with these families. It's very introspective, almost spiritual. We were talking about that at one point. And we hear the sounds of the village, the sound of the river, the banter of the children. In a way, we're inside that family. Can you talk a little bit about your creative decisions in terms of this very unique visual and audio sort of aesthetic of the film?
Yeah, thank you, Ruben. It was not very hard to make that decision, and actually for me it's never really a decision. I just feel that this is how it should be, and maybe not how it should be, but the film told me, this is how it should be, and the people and the families and their stories told me how this should be. I spent 3 years with these families. I lived with them, I slept with them, I lived on the floating village, I ate their food, I slept in their home in the jungles, I stayed with, Kyo in her dormitory, little tiny dormitory that she shared with 5 other people, and so I lived with them, and I want you to live with them too. I want you to feel what I felt and what they went through, and understand, the beauty of their lives. And I don't want anyone else, to get in the way of that, not even myself. It was a really difficult decision, actually, at the very end of the film when I, included myself. Actually, I was really against it. Chris Brown, the editor, who did a spectacular job on the editing, he said, no, Kalyanee, you have to include it. I said, no, Chris, I don't want to do it because I just don't want to get in the way of the story. I want the people, the families to tell their story, not me. And he said, no, but you have to because the audience has to understand how much work and effort you put into the film. how much work and effort you put into, and the love and care that you had, for these families. The fact that you spent all this time living with them, he needs to be revealed. And so I finally relented, and I'm glad I did, because I think in that moment, at least for me, when I watch it, it just brings me back, takes me back to that time, when I was with them. But the sound, I think that the screening here, oh my God, it's incredible. Yeah, the sound is just amazing. I really love the sound. Hearing the sound here, just like the forest and the rice and everything, the harvesting is just beautiful. And I really want people to hear those sounds, and to really, to live it. Skywalker sound, actually, Zach Martin and Angie Yessen did the sound and the sound design. And Skywalker, sponsored it, and we just had an amazing time, mixing it in their facility. But the sound, I feel, it's just the natural, soundtrack, for the film. It really draws you in. I hope it did.
Well, that's appropriate. We're screening it here in a theater designed by George Lucas, my favorite theater in LA. Every time we screen a film here, the filmmakers always say, "That's the best I've ever heard or seen my film." So we're lucky to be able to see it here. In your life, you've worked, your work has really been focused on marginalized, disenfranchised communities, refugees and others who have been sort of disproportionately impacted. I think it comes out of your own life experience, and you've done that as an attorney, as a scholar, and now as a storyteller. Can you talk about storytelling in your life, telling new stories about yourself and your world, and the power of storytelling in addressing these sort of social justice issues?
Thanks, Ben. Storytelling, I think all of us are storytellers. I think we're all born storytellers, and the reason is because we want to connect with others. We want to hear stories in order to feel that we are not alone in the world. I've always been interested in stories. Ever since I was a little girl, I just read voraciously, on the bus, on the toilet, during recess, everywhere, anywhere I could, lay my hand on a book, I was reading. I just love to hear stories and read stories. But as I grew up, I enjoyed even more just listening to stories and hearing people's stories. And even as a lawyer, I was listening to people's stories. I was working in Los Angeles for the Asia Pacific American Legal Center and assisting domestic violence survivors to file cases using the Violence Against Women Act. And then I was working in South Africa in the refugee law clinic at the University of Witwatersrand, assisting refugees with their application, for refugee status. And so I had to hear their stories, and I wanted to hear their stories. And I knew that only by listening to their stories, can I ever really understand their life and understand what they are going through, and then understand what we can do to help them. If we don't listen, we can't understand them. We can't possibly know what we can do. And the problem with our world, I think, is that people don't listen. We don't listen to each other. We zone out. We turn on the television. We take our iPads or iPods. We take our iPhones. We have all these mechanisms for zoning out. We don't listen to each other anymore. And politicians especially don't listen to people. They don't care what people think. They only do what is right for them and their pocketbook. And that's happening here in the US, and that's happening in Cambodia as well. The government has no, they don't care. They don't care if people are being thrown off their land, if they have no more access to their livelihood, and that there's no way that they'll be able to make ends meet with $61 US a month. They don't care because they are making a profit. And that's the problem, is when we are only seeking profit and not seeking to better people's lives. But storytelling, I feel that is the answer. The answer is for us to listen to one another and to help each other tell one another's stories. I was actually in South Dakota recently. I'm working on a short documentary about the Lakota people and their children who are being removed from their families and placed in foster care homes and foster care facilities. And God, what is happening there it just blows my mind. The kids are being taken from some of them are being taken without any reason, real reason, and their parents are fighting for their kids. Have been fighting for the kids for like 7 years and have not seen their children. And some of these kids are being placed in facilities where they're being drugged and given, psychiatric drugs at the age of 2 or 5 or 10 years old.
Why? What is the excuse?
Money. The state of South Dakota is making millions of dollars off of these foster care homes and facilities. But that's another topic. But the reason why I wanted to bring that topic up is because there's a woman I've interviewed, and she's Lakota, and she's a grandmother, and she actually was placed in the boarding schools, in 1940s, when she was 5 and 6 years old. And in the boarding school, they cut off her braids, forced her to speak English, which she didn't even speak. She couldn't speak Lakota. She couldn't practice her native culture. And this is what's happening in the United States. And the priests who were taking these children, they were physically and sexually abusing the children. And so at that time, she was taken from her home. Now her grandchildren are being taken from their homes and placed in foster care. But anyway, that's another topic. But what she said to me was that in Lakota culture, you don't listen with your eyes. You listen with your ears. And so they never make eye contact. Sorry, I'm making eye contact with you. You look the other way and you listen, you open your ears up and open it wide so that you can hear everything that's coming in through your ears. And that so that you can understand what people are saying. And then, only then can you respond. And that's why we tell stories. So that we can listen with our ears and we can respond appropriately.
And you yourself don't have a formal background in sort of film training, but I guess I could say only characterize your work as fearless. Ever since law school, you've been out sort of making films in very difficult situations all over the world. And what advice do you have for our young filmmakers who may want to make a documentary, who may want to tell a different kind of story that you have learned in your process about filmmaking? What advice would you give to them?
My advice is you don't have to be a filmmaker. That's first. Really, anybody who has the passion to tell a particular story should make that story, should document that story, and that's what happened to me. I was working in Iraq. And I felt really impassioned about what was happening in Iraq at that time, about the occupation of Iraq. And then the consequence of that was that 2 million Iraqi refugees were forced out of their country and forced to neighboring countries like Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and all over the world. And at that time, I knew that was a story that I needed to tell. And even though I had no technical background, I was doing a little bit of photography in Mozambique, but really no video camera. But that didn't even enter my mind. I just knew that I had to do it. That I had this story I had to tell and I needed to tell it right away. And I needed to tell it through a medium that many people will understand. And I knew that the news, the media outlets that we listen to, CNN, and what else is there? Fox News, and New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Those are great, sources of information, but they're not necessarily the most unbiased ones. And I knew that the only way that we could get unbiased information was from the direct source, the people themselves. And so for filmmakers and non-filmmakers, I think my advice is really just to follow your heart and your passion. Whatever you feel passionate about, do it. And that is what will come through. Your passion will come through. If you don't feel so passionate about it, if you're only doing it because, you think it's going to make a lot of money, or it's something that you think people will be interested in, but you're not really interested in it yourself. I think that will reveal itself as well. So I really think if you have the passion for something, if you want to tell a story, go for it. And really work hard, because it's going to be hard.
There is life after law school, apparently. So let's open it up for questions and answers. I just ask that you articulate, stand up, maybe speak a little loud so we can capture it in the video. Who wants to ask the first question? Yes, we'll start over here.
Did you say you did not study cinematography formally at all?
Not at all.
That's amazing. You did cinematography thing as well?
Yes, thank you.
Will you go back to law?
Isn't that an easy question? Well, I don't know. Again, I think the world that we live in, we live with these stereotypes. We live with categories. We like to define ourselves as lawyers, cinematographers, directors, filmmakers, capitalists or non-capitalists. There's all these definitions and categories that I feel really limit us. I don't really like to consider myself even a filmmaker or even a lawyer, maybe just a storyteller. And I think that, even now as I make, this film and other films, I'm using my law degree. I'm using my legal knowledge. So in a way I am practicing law, and I think all of us, can practice law too, as long as we are using our legal knowledge and we're learning. And all of us can be storytellers and filmmakers as well. I'm just empowering everyone to do anything they want.
Yes, in the back.
What took you to Mozambique?
So I was working in South Africa at the refugee law clinic, and then I made a trip up north to Mozambique and fell in love with the country. It was just much more, the humidity, the passion, the music, the food. It was so different from South Africa, and the history. Really reminded me of Cambodia. The people there really reminded me of Cambodia as well. So I went back there and I found a position there with a legal consulting firm that worked through USAID, with the Ministry of Labor, and I worked on labor law reform there.
Yes, over here.
Funny, how did you hook up with post-production? With Skywalker Sound, you haven't been any films, you haven't any credits to it.
Yeah. I have so many good stories. So the MacArthur Foundation, they funded the project. I met them in Cambodia, and I gave them a tour of Tuls Leng, the president and the chairman, and the board members. I gave them a tour of Tuls Leng. I had no idea I was going to make this film, but I was just thinking about it maybe a few days before. And as we were going through the museum, Tuls Leng is the execution center. It's a high school that was converted into an execution center during the Khmer Rouge regime, and they killed like hundreds of people there, and forced confessions from them, and then took a picture of them, and then posted on the walls. And so the Tuls Leng is filled with photographs, portraits of people who were killed during the Khmer Rouge regime. And so as I was walking through the halls, I thought to myself, oh my God, this is crazy. We're walking through this hall and we're looking into the past, but look at the present. Look at what is happening right now in Cambodia. So I spoke with the chairman, I spoke with the president, I spoke with the board members, and I said, stop everyone. We're looking at these photos, but what is happening right now in Cambodia? I listed all the things that were happening. I don't want us to walk through these halls and look at photographs of garment factory workers, of indigenous people who have been thrown off their land, and people who have been forced, who are struggling to fish because all of the fish have been fished to extinction by companies, and also by hydroelectric dams that are being built upstream in China and Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia. And so, I'm a crazy woman, so they said, oh, that sounds like a great idea. I told them my idea of the documentary, and they ended up funding it. Skywalker, I just called them.
Fearless.
I just said, hey, I'm making this documentary. It's great. It's amazing. I was in Cambodia for 3 years. Can you do something for me? And I happened to meet the woman, the producer there, who is a dear friend of mine now. And she just had a honeymoon in Cambodia. And she loved and fell in love with Cambodia. And she asked me to come to Skywalker, and she toured me, toured the grounds, you know, and oh my God, this is amazing. I can't believe I'm here. You know, we were at the SAG Theater, and she showed me clips of, you know, Star Wars before it was touched, you know, and then Star Wars after the sound was fixed. And I was like, and she's like, yeah, this is where you're going to screen your film. I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, and then so finally we made our way to the office after she, like, you know, wowed us. And then I said, Carrie, I just want to be honest with you. I have no budget at all. I have nothing. And she said, oh, Kalyanee, don't worry about it. So that's what happened.
First off, I wanted to thank you for saving me some time. Understanding the world takes a lot of effort sometimes, and this was a very pure opportunity to just get a firm understanding of the world and the science. One question I have is some people argue that sweatshops or factories offer an opportunity to sort of get your foot on the economic ladder, and you had a lot of experience with that. And so I wondered what your opinion is about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we went through the Industrial Revolution in the United States. You know, we had, you know, Lowell, Massachusetts, you know, filled with women workers, and, you know, we are the product of that, right, of that Industrial Revolution. And, you know, that is an argument that this is the step, you know, this is the stepping stone towards, you know, more industrialization. And, you know, it's really complicated, I have to say. You know, I went into this film with a lot of questions, and I left, you know, making this film with many even more questions. And what I'm hoping is that, you know, these conversations that we're having will engender, you know, conversation and solutions to the issues that we're faced with. So to talk about the positive things in Cambodia that has happened because of these factories, you know, Kyo, like you saw in the film, you know, she said, I want the factory to come to my village. You know, she says herself, in her own words, that this is what she wants. She wants to work in the factory, and she, you know, but she wants the factory in her village so that she doesn't have to travel far, so that she can stay with her family and live with her family and be with her family, and so that her village can also have electricity and roads and the infrastructure necessary for her to live the life that we live. So she wants what we want. And I don't think that's wrong. You know, I think it's totally understandable to want what we have. We have a great life here. You know, we have computers, we have cars, although I hate cars. But at least, I wish we had trains instead. But, you know, we have the luxuries that she wants. And we have education, most of all. You know, but the question, though, is how do we get those things without destroying ourselves? You know, how do we get those things without destroying the forests and the land and the water and, you know, everything that we have? You know, even in the United States, we've destroyed a lot of forests and a lot of land to be where we are today. You know, all the way up the coast of California, all the way up to Seattle, to Washington, it was covered with redwood trees. We don't have redwood trees anymore, except a few little, you know, groves here and there. And where I live in Sonoma, that's where the redwood trees are. But they don't really exist anymore. Not the way that they did. All the buffaloes, you know, in South Dakota, they're gone. You know, so what sacrifices are we willing to make to have the life that we live? That's really the question. You know, what sacrifices are we willing to make? I don't think we need to sacrifice that much if we do it properly. You know, if we do it intelligently, and if we do it conservatively. You know, if we should be able to protect our forests and our land and have progress too. Why not? You know, I mean, if it wasn't for Ford and if it wasn't for the car industry and the oil industry, we would have a train running through Los Angeles right now. You know, we wouldn't have to sit through traffic and through smog. You know, we would be able to take the train, you know, Jennifer and I could have taken the train, a bullet train from San Francisco all the way down to Los Angeles if they allowed that train to be built. But they didn't. Why? It's because of profit. And everything right now is because of profit. You know, if you're only thinking about profit, you're only thinking to make money, then the outcome will be just money. It won't be happiness. It won't be, you know, preservation. It won't be conservation. And it won't be, you know, maintaining the relationships and the love and the family that we want to maintain. So yes, you know, I think it's important that we have, you know, factories and we have work, but pay them a livable wage. Pay them the amount of money they need to be, you know, they deserve to make. You know, when I was in Cambodia recently to document the national elections, you know, I actually went to document Kyo, you know, to meet with her and ask her, you know, how she felt about the elections. And I asked her, Kyo, what do you want? You know, what do you want out of this election? You know, what do you want for you and your family? She said, you know, I just want a livable wage. I just want $150 a month, and that will be enough for me and my family. Maybe not enough, maybe I'll ask for more later, but at least for now, at least $150. Because right now, I can't even afford to buy morning glory. You know, that vegetable that she bought, that they put in the plastic bag. She was like, oh my God, why am I paying $1.25 per kilo for this vegetable? She said the price of that vegetable has even gone up. The price of salt, the price of sugar, the price of all the basic necessities that it takes to make a meal for her in her little dormitory has gone up, and she can't afford that. She can't afford the rent, she can't afford the water, she can't afford the electricity, you know, and also help her mother back home. So pay a livable wage, at least start with that.
Yes, right here.
I was wondering, when we were watching the movie, I saw women wearing like a scarf on their face.
Yeah.
Now, is that a fashion statement or something the matter with the air or what?
A scarf or the mask?
That mask
Yeah.
they wore right here. I saw a lot of women like they were covering
Yeah.
half of their face.
Yeah, it's because of the air. You know, there's a lot of dust in Cambodia. You know, a lot of actually the roads that are built are really not stable. I mean, they're not built to last a lifetime. You know, they're built really not well, and many of them are built by actually the Chinese. and so there's a lot of dust that are kicking around in Cambodia, but then they also wear it, you know, in the factories and when they work in the factories.
Yes, in the back.
Okay, just talk a little more about the current political changes. You said they had demonstration after the election.
Oh, Jennifer, sorry. Could you pass out the questions too?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. The current election and the changes. Yeah, so the current election, you know, I was just there, and we've actually had a lot of protests even before the elections. You know, there are people who are protesting, the factory workers were protesting the factory conditions. I don't know if you've heard, but there was a collapse of a factory, first of all in Bangladesh, and then later on in Cambodia as well.
Big news.
But yeah, it made big news. And after that factory collapse, I mean, people were protesting way before that. But after that collapse, I mean, thousands strong, you know, the workers went out into the streets and were protesting, you know, the factory working conditions. And also, you know, demanding higher wages, you know, for them and their families. But there's also been an incredible amount of protests against the land grabbing that's happening in Cambodia. Not just in the jungles and forests, but in the provinces, you know, and even in the city. You know, and I don't know if you may not be aware of this, you know, because you're probably not so connected to Cambodian contemporary issues, but in Phnom Penh, there's a lake called Mokok. And that lake is completely filled with sand now. That lake, there are 3 lakes in Phnom Penh, the city, the capital city. And these lakes are the reservoir for the heavy monsoon rain. You know, when it rains heavily in the city, the water flows into the lake and it captures all that, you know, excess water. Without those lakes, now that they're covered with sand, there's, you know, the whole city is going to flood. It has been flooding. But they're covering this lake because they want to build condominiums and business complexes and skyscrapers and so forth. And all the people, 4,000 people in the villages around this lake in Phnom Penh were evacuated. Not evacuated, but evicted from their homes. You know, and there have been huge protests against those evictions. And a lot of the women who were spearheading the protests have been detained. One woman is still in prison right now for protesting against the land grabbing. And there have been people who have died protesting the land grabbing and the cutting down of the forests in Cambodia. And so it's really hot and heavy in Cambodia right now, and the government knows it. You know, and just before the elections, people were, you know, up in arms, you know, demanding change, you know, yelling change, change, change. You know, they want change in Cambodia. Change from the current government to another government. Who knows what the new government will bring, but at least it will be different. At least it will be something different. And so the election result is that, you know, it's a parliamentary system in Cambodia, and 68 votes, 68 seats went to the current regime, the current government, and 52 or 56 went to the opposition party. And the opposition party is claiming that that's wrong because of all the election fraud that's been committed during the elections. You know, some people didn't see their names on the rosters. Some people couldn't vote. Some people were threatened, you know, if they voted you know, for the opposition party. You know, and some people voted many times with the same thumb, you know, because they stamped their thumbprint, you know, when they vote in Cambodia. And what they did was they gave them ink that was easily, you know, removed so they could vote several times with the same name. So there's a lot of election fraud that took place, and right now, you know, as I said, thousands of people are protesting that the election results are demanding a review of the results, so that, you know, at least, you know, the opposition party can regain the rightful seats that they deserve. But yeah, the future for Cambodia it's really uncertain right now. I mean, people are really angry, you know, but it's happening. But the anger is in Phnom Penh. You know, it's around the urban centers where people have access to media, access to information, you know, access to what is going on. But in other parts of the country, in remote places like where South Samoan and her family live, they have nothing. They have no electricity, no TV, no radio, nothing. And so they have no idea what's happening. And so they have no idea that people are being thrown off their land like they are. And so what we are aiming to do, coming back to the film, is we have an outreach campaign called Changing the Course. And we are aiming to screen the film in 60 villages and universities all across the country to help raise awareness about what is happening in Cambodia, because not everyone knows. You know, and I think that the more people are conscious, especially the young people in the universities, the more conscious they are about what is happening, that more people will feel compelled, you know, to do something about it. And hopefully, maybe I'm hoping it's sooner than later, but hopefully in 5 years' time, before the next elections, that change will happen. So yeah, if you want more information about that, you can go on our website and then sign up as well. And there's also, we're trying to organize grassroots screenings all across the country as well. You know, on university campuses and with organizations. We've already received nearly 100 requests so far for screenings all across the country, and we would like to get more. So if any of you are interested, or if you know anyone, any school or organization that are interested in screening a film like this and having a conversation like this, because I think this kind of conversation is important. You know, it's not just about watching a movie, you know, but really about changing our perspective. You know, yesterday we screened at a high school, And the students were amazing. I mean, they were asking questions, I'm sorry, even better than all of you. You know, they were really in tune. And I mean, one person was like asking about, you know, child labor laws and, you know, what I thought about that, and, you know, just all kinds of questions. And they told me, you know, afterwards they came up to me, they ran up to me, she's like, oh my God, I feel so inspired, you know, I really want to do something, I really want to, you know, make a difference, you know, in the, like, you're my hero, and, you know, it's just really nice. It just, I think those kind of conversations are really important.
Angelique.
What was the reaction to the film when you screened it in Cambodia?
Oh my God. That was incredible. Oh, it's just the most amazing, I'm sorry to tell this to everyone here too, but the most amazing screening I've ever been to. And there were 600 people at the screening. 200 of them were parents of garment factory workers. And, you know, just like, you know, Kyo's parents, and all the families came to the screening. We actually went all the way up to Ratanak to pick up the family living in the jungles and brought them back to Phnom Penh. And that was their first time in a city. You know, first time in Phnom Penh, first time seeing, you know, so many people, first time in a movie theater, first time watching a film, let alone a film about themselves. So they were really shocked, you know, but Kyo and City and South Samoan were really amazed by the film, and they were really touched by it. And, you know, actually Kyo told me that, you know, she really wished I had told her how big the film would be, because she would have worn makeup, clothes, and, you know, City's father said if, you know, Al asked to be if we could do it all over again, you know, and this time he would wear better clothes. You know, and it was just amazing. I mean, the response was, and, you know, what was different about the screening was that we all spoke Khmer. So it was all in Khmer, the audience was Khmer, you know, and the people, you know, were so touched by the film, because they are going through it, so they spoke about their experience rather than asking me questions. You know, and there's this one woman in the audience, you know, she was incredible. You know, she stood up and she was actually Chan. You know, and she wore a hijab, and, you know, and she looked at me and she said, oh my God, for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong in this community. You know, I feel like I belong in this country. And I feel like I am a part of Cambodia. And that was just, that floored me. I mean, you can't expect a better response than that, you know, because it's true. You know, most ethnic minorities in Cambodia don't feel like they're part of the country. I mean, it's not like there's a lot of hatred against them. Actually, they live very harmoniously with one another, but there's still a feeling of distance, this feeling of being different. You know, and especially the ethnic minorities, the indigenous people living in the Northeast. You know, it's really difficult for them to navigate. You know, the majority, you know, community. But the response was incredible there. And when I went back to Cambodia to document the elections, we actually screened the film in Kyo's factory dormitory. Yeah, to like 300, 400, maybe even, I don't know, 400, 500 people. There were a lot of people there. And people were like hanging over the balcony, sitting on the floor. We just screened it inside the dormitory. You know, the hallways where you saw them cutting the fish and cleaning their food and stuff. That's where we screened it. And, you know, and that was amazing to see Kyo transform. You know, she came up, she spoke. You know, I asked her to come up and talk, and she just took the microphone from me. And she's like, oh, this is so, you know, I'm so happy, you know, I am here today, and, you know, that I'm able to share my story with everyone here. And to finally, she said, finally share my story with everyone here. And she said, the story that I believe everyone here shares. You know, I mean, for her to say something like that, that's a raise in consciousness, you know, and so I can only imagine, you know, what kind of consciousness we can build, you know, just by screening the film all throughout Cambodia and all throughout the United States, you know, and elsewhere.
So, in the last decade, there's been a lot of independent cinema work in South Asia. Like there's been like many inspiring independent filmmakers in South Asia. But thing, like across many countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and also from Cambodia, I think. But the thing is, most of the stories they decide to tell usually have to do with the lower class. And like some people even like call it as poverty porn or something like that, like exploitation of poverty. And well, I do believe in the fact that like the lower class people face this, and like that they're really struggling and living in such conditions. But what struck me is the lack of depiction of the middle class and the upper class in South Asian media. And generally, it has been linked to how the West usually portrays South Asia in media. Like they're associating it with the Orientals, and like that's what they call it.
Yeah.
So like that's the fact that you as a person grew up in the West. So how do you think that affects your work, and what do you think about the how depiction of South Asia by South Asian filmmakers themselves are going to be in the coming decades?
Yeah, that's a really amazing question. It's a great one. Where are you from?
Burma.
Burma, wow. I really want to go to Burma, and actually an idea for Burma too. But no, I completely agree with you, and I think about that all the time. How we portray one another and each other and ourselves affects how people perceive us. It's inevitable with media. We have so much power, so much control, and so much influence. People believe what we say. And so with that power and with that comes, responsibility, to tell the truth and to make, to provide portrayals that are accurate. And I agree with you, there is a middle class and there is an upper class in Cambodia as well. But, I think that I think individuals have to choose, which ground they want to stand on. And for me, it's always been the marginalized class that I've been interested in, because I came from a marginalized class. This is my background. I was a refugee escaping Cambodia, came to the United States as an immigrant, and really struggled in this country to make, to be where I am today. My family is still struggling, and so I have an affinity towards people who are struggling through the same things, and that's the story that I want to tell. But I completely agree with you that we need to change, the perception that people have of Southeast Asia, and to show a deeper story, a more complex story. And I think that is the responsibility of other artists. And I've met those artists in Cambodia. Actually the artists community in Cambodia is really growing and really exploding, and I'm really excited about that. I think it's amazing that young people right now are interested in other things besides the Khmer Rouge. And this is just one step. The Khmer Rouge has been pervasive in, in Cambodian repertoire, for like decades. This is one step to remove people away from just that perspective. I think another step, and this comes from my other colleagues in Cambodia, is to help people to understand that there are other things happening in Cambodia too. There is art that is alive, there's music, there's culture, and the young people are really building that. And I hope that they will help to expose those things, to all of us. But definitely I agree with you that we have a responsibility, to provide an accurate portrayal, but to also not just show the, the sadness, but also the light.
For those of you who are interested in seeing the film again, it will get a limited theatrical release. It'll be at the Lemley Theater which one on
Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills on October 11th. And the ArcLight?
Yeah, and the ArcLight October 10th. And in New York, we have friends in New York. It's going to be at IFC on October 4th, for 7 days. So you have 7 days at the Lemley Beverly Hills to see the film again, or I don't know if you want to see it again, but maybe you want to share it with your friends and your family. And I'll be there, so it'll be an opportunity to meet your friends and family. Thank you.
And I'm sure she'll stick around to meet with people if you want to continue the conversation. You know, it was really an extraordinary evening. I thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking my dear friend, Kalyanee Mam.